in order of speaking, we have Ian Blakeman, who is Executive Governor at 2 reform prisons currently, I think adding more prisons next month. So obviously kind of really at the coalface of the government's, one of the government's very big reforms, and previously has worked in both strategic and operational roles. Joanne Drew, who is Director of Housing for Nacro, and everybody in this room will be very, very aware of just how vital housing is and secure, stable housing is to rehabilitation. And obviously Nacro is also part of a CRC, so delivering probation services. Gary Monahan, who is a frequent speaker for reform, certainly a good friend of reforms, we'll say that, who is currently Digital Prisons Lead at NOMS, but also has previously been Governor of Prisons and done a mixture again of strategic and more operational roles. And finally, Jerry Petherick, who is Managing Director of Custodial and Detention Service at G4S, and also has formerly been a Governor, so and again has had that mixture of strategic and operational. So just such a wealth of both experience, expertise and knowledge from our panel. The focus, obviously, of this session, as Andrew said, is how we actually deliver the rehabilitation revolution. So how do we get that, if we can use the word seamless, perhaps that's quite an ambitious word, but we are ambitious for reform. So a seamless offender journey through prisons and probation. It's very easy to talk about through the gate services, very easy to say, well, you know, we must have the right services delivered by the right people at the right time in the right place. But actually, as successive governments have found, it's a lot more difficult to actually achieve that. Although I'm sure our panellists will tell us exactly how we can achieve it, so we will look forward to getting to that point. As, again, Andrew mentioned, obviously, we're disappointed Liz Truss couldn't join us today, but she did deliver her big speech in launching the white paper last year on a reform platform, for which we were delighted. And in that white paper, it talks about the need to have wholesale cultural and structural change to deliver the sort of rehabilitation outcomes we want to see. So I think the scale of ambition is definitely there. The question is the detail that sits behind it and how we actually achieve it. And as I mentioned, successive governments have had a priority in decreasing reoffending rates. We know the costs, not just in terms of finances, but in terms of the offenders themselves, their families, their victims, and communities in general. So it is terribly important that we do get this right. But perhaps not quite as complicated as the NHS, but it's certainly up there as one of the service areas, particularly because it is so fragmented, as we've heard, that is very difficult to bring people together to deliver that seamless journey. So I will shut up at that point. Hopefully that gives enough of a flavour of obviously what we're talking about in this panel. So without further ado, can I, again, obviously thank our panellists, but also invite Ian up to kick us off.
Thank you. I think it's the first time I've had the loo break slot, but hopefully Charlotte's covered that and everyone's now back in the room. I'm going to try and do 5 minutes, so there's plenty of time for questions, because I think that's the most valuable part from these sorts of events. So Ian Blakeman, currently known as Executive Governor of Home House, Kirklevington, Grange, which we call Teesside Reform Prisons. From next week, I'll be Director of Tees and Weir Reform Prisons, with Durham and Deerbolt joining us. We describe our work as working together to create chances for change and hope for the future. Working together is about community. It's about understanding the need to connect to community. We all know that what matters, happens back in the community. That's where the outcomes are delivered in terms of changing lives, protecting the public, and that's where our focus needs to be. So we've been working hard to connect with our communities. We've been working with an organisation called Involve to try and develop an open government approach, transparency, participation, accountability. That's about making sure that we connect with our communities. It's also about making sure we make the best possible decisions in the way that we run the prisons. So we're developing a data and evidence advisory board, local academics, independently chaired, helping us understand what we do in our prisons, how we use data, how we use evidence to do the best possible things. It's also about the way in which we engage with the people who work in our prisons, the way that we listen to our staff, the way that we listen to each other, and the way that we listen to the men in the prisons, to make sure that every voice gets heard and that in doing so we make the best possible decisions as we reform our prisons. So working together is critical for how we operate our prisons. Chances for Change is about how we make sure that everybody knows that they come into our prisons for a purpose, and that's to change their lives. We know that everyone can change. We believe that. It's critical our staff believe it, and we work to make sure that's the case, that everybody can change while they're with us, but they need to change. And again, that's a really vital thing that we make clear in our prisons. People need to change. If they didn't, they wouldn't have come into prison in the first place. So we want to be clear about the progress that they need to make. We want to set that out very clearly. We want to monitor that, review it, and make sure that people are making progress while in the time they're with us. Brian mentioned the critical rollout of key workers, additional prison officers who are going to support that work of ensuring that every man is having a conversation every week with a trained professional prison officer to motivate them on their journey of change. It's also about making sure that those opportunities are there in an environment that supports change. And it's really important to say that the most important thing we can do in the coming months is ensure that we're operating safe prisons. We need a safe, stable base in order to be able to give people the opportunity to change in the time that they're with us. And again, it's really important to say that we know that we're not in that position at the moment in many of our prisons, and there's much more work to do to make our prisons safe. So vitally important that to create chances for change, we need safe, stable prisons, and then we need opportunities for change. So that's about transforming our learning experience so that we've got the best possible provision, that we use our contractual powers that we now have as empowered prisons to make change in the way that we provide education and learning and give people the best opportunities, that we get more work into our prisons in the way that we open up and work with local business, again about creating chances for change. All of these are opportunities for men to turn their lives around in the time that they're with us so that we can serve the public. Critical to that is doing something about drugs. Again, in terms of violence and stability in our prisons, the amount of drugs has been one of the challenges that we face. So we're really, we've got a real opportunity, particularly at Home House Prison, where we're going to be investing in making Home House a drug recovery prison and really showing what can be done with the right level of resource in the prison. So all of that is really critical. Our role is about supporting stronger communities, giving people those chances for change, and that's because our focus is on that hope for the future, being really clear that we can support safer communities, and we can do that by the work that we do in the prison. And the hope for the future is hope for communities, for less crime, hope for the families of the men, that they can put their lives back together, and critically, it's giving men that focus that there's a positive opportunity in terms of their future lives, being assets to their communities rather than being seen as a problem. We've done a number of things in the prison to try to support that, including critically the way that we're working with our police and crime commissioners, the way that we're working with local authorities, particular focus on trying to do better on housing. It'd be interesting to see what Joanne has to say in a moment, because housing is one of those critical issues that we need to resolve, and also getting people back into jobs. And the work we're doing with employment in the prison is about getting people back into jobs on their release. So that's what prison reform's about. It's about taking control of all of those things locally and making a difference. The Safety and Reform Programme is giving us a plan for doing that. The theme of this conference is about the future for criminal justice reform, with a question mark. The point I'd want to make is that we're clear about what that journey needs to be. We're getting the resources we need to be able to do that. The Safety and Reform Programme sets out our journey, but we also need to be clear it's going to take time to go on that journey, and we need to work with everybody to make that possible. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Nacro is a social justice charity. We're 50 years old this year. Our roots started in the prison and criminal justice sectors, where we supported released prisoners and their families to rehabilitate themselves. Over the years, we've grown as a charity. We're now a predominantly contracting-based business, delivering education, employment, health, housing and justice services. So the criminal justice sector remains very important to us. At Nacro, I'm housing director, and it's my job to house a wide range of people across England and Wales, vulnerable people mostly, and this includes working with offenders, including in partnerships with CRCs and others, to make housing and support available to released prisoners. Now, this is all short-term housing, and one of our biggest challenges, like others, many of you, working in the criminal justice sector, is to ensure long-term stable housing for offenders to reduce reoffending. Now, I'm going to talk about the wider housing landscape and why we're faced with significant challenges that means that we all need to think and act differently to how we've done so far. I think housing has become one of the biggest social justice issues that this country is facing. A couple of weeks ago at an event, Sajid Javid, the Secretary of State for Communities, also recognised that, as does the government in labelling its new housing white paper this year as our broken housing market. And the reason for that, one of the reasons for that, is that housing today is controlled by people who see housing as a financial asset rather than a home. Now, the impact of that system and the way things have arisen in England and Wales is clear for everyone to see. So now, across the country, we're seeing increasing homelessness, increasing rough sleeping, and it's not just a phenomenon of London and the south or core cities, it's across the country. Councils are spending on average £2 million per day to accommodate people, vulnerable people, in temporary accommodation. It's one of their biggest financial challenges amongst a range of challenges that they are facing. Now, housing organisations, housing associations like Nacro are playing a major role, but they're currently constrained. Less than 20% of the homes that they allocate to new tenants have been homeless. They target lower to middle income tenants in addition. The private rented sector is now the destination for many vulnerable tenants. Rents are rising above household incomes, and there are high deposit requirements, high reference thresholds. So in addition to that, the private rented sector is meeting the needs of a much wider group of residents, including families and those who can't afford to buy their own home. And it also offers little protection from evictions and rent increases. So in that picture, demand for housing is such that competition is severe. Now, absolutely, released prisoners are assets to our communities potentially, but the system does not treat them like that. We know that released prisoners with no home to go to face multiple barriers to accessing housing. For example, single men are not deemed to be in priority need for council housing, period. Offending can be seen and used as a reason to class somebody as unsuitable to be a social housing tenant, and private landlords will often not accept ex-offenders or those on benefits. So multiple barriers for offenders. And we know even the best resettlement system and advice offer, which we know is some way from being delivered consistently across the country, this will struggle to overcome these systemic barriers to housing. But we know that a stable home is the base for a life away from crime. And right now, providers in transforming rehabilitation and the government is asking us all to do more on housing and employment, quite rightly, but there's a real challenge here. It's also a time when government is reducing the housing benefit regime, so increasing more severe caps and restrictions. It's also reviewing the funding for supported housing, which means that there is increased uncertainty on how our housing provision will be funded longer term. So it makes it very difficult to invest in new housing. So the environment is tougher than it's ever been to meet housing needs. So we have to take a different approach to this. I think there are two main ways that we in the criminal justice sector can tackle this. And the first is to focus on increasing the supply of housing. And the second is to ensure fair access of offenders to it. So in terms of supply, generally, our national output of new housing has slowed to a 24-year low, and the solutions in that housing white paper announced this year are absolutely unlikely to reach vulnerable people and excluded people, especially in the short term. And if I just give an example of a government initiative, a good initiative of disposing of public land to increase housing supply, this has resulted in just 20% of the resulted housing being available for affordable rents. And as few as 7% of that housing is likely to be social housing on rents that people can afford on lower incomes, such as offenders. And as I've explained already, offenders find multiple barriers to accessing that housing. So short term, we as a sector must be prepared to use our own assets, our resources, our financial capacity and our partnerships to secure more housing so that that can be specifically accessed by offenders. So to give an example again, at government level, the Ministry of Justice periodically talks about the disposal of its own land and prison estates to change the mix of provision. We should be seeking to use those assets to lever in housing and employment opportunities for released offenders. So investment in housing for that group with prioritised access to released prisoners is an investment in reducing reoffending rates and all the national costs that go with that. And so it must be a core part of the transforming rehabilitation agenda going forward. The second way, in addition to increasing supply, that we can influence players in the housing system is to reduce those barriers I've talked about. Offenders must be considered fairly for housing, and we must identify when this is not happening and work for change. For example, housing decision makers should be asked to consider the specific risks they believe that makes an offender an unsuitable tenant. Now, we already have legislation that gives offenders a fair chance at employment, and at Nacro we've been working for many years to promote and campaign on that issue, and we have our Ban the Box campaign, which advocates a risk-based approach. We need something similar in the housing space. So we really welcome the Homelessness Reduction Bill, which is set, when enacted, to put a wider prevention and relief duty on local authorities in terms of housing. It will require a cultural change to move from inevitably a gatekeeping system of scarce resources to one that's seeking to prevent homelessness at a very early stage. Now, across the country, there are a number of homelessness trailblazer funds placed in local authorities and working in partnerships which are seeking to test how that new prevention duty could work. And we in the criminal justice sector must be at the heart of that, helping to ensure that we can prevent homelessness of offenders. So my overall message is that at all levels we have to be more active in creating additional housing solutions and ensuring fair access to the housing that exists, to play our part in creating a housing market that works for everyone and to reduce reoffending in the process.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Gary Monahan. I'm governing governor by background, so I'm involved in delivering technology into prisons, and I work for Brian Clark, who's stolen half of what I was going to say to you. So what I really want to talk about is the process of digitising prisons and just some of the key points of taking that forward, but in terms of being able to join up the whole system for all our partners and for ourselves. But to also talk particularly around the requirements to use technology to help with safety and security in prisons. Because the first thing we've got to really do with our technology in prisons and the digitisation of prisons is really help governors and staff in terms of managing order and control in prisoners more successfully. So we've got to use the technology to try and free officers up to be able to interact with prisoners to a great degree, to take mundane tasks away from those officers, pass the responsibility to prisoners on a day-to-day basis, make them more responsible and less reliant on those officers and less institutionalised. Because that's very important if we're going to try and get offenders moved towards a principle of normality and being responsible, just as we all are on a day-to-day basis, for our own administration and our own selves. Because we take that away from prisoners, it means that effectively what we're doing is we're passing that responsibility to officers and compounding the impacts of imprisonment. So we need to use technology to reverse that. We also need to use the technology to also exploit ways and means of being able to disrupt organised crime in prisons. So no doubt you'll have seen newspaper articles around drones flying into jails and the orchestration of getting drugs and illegal devices, mobile phones into prisons. So we've also got to use the process of digitising prisons to be able to challenge those issues, because they're also impacting on our ability to run safe, decent and secure establishments. So once we've done that, which isn't going to be the easiest of jobs, but that's part of our objectives, we will then be able to really move forward in terms of, for the first time, I think, being able to offer a through-the-gate service to offenders and to join up with all our partners using that digital infrastructure that we're putting in place. I think in a digital world, it is absolutely impossible for us really to get to a place whereby we can have joined up through-the-gate services if we do not give prisoners access to networks and to technology. And we don't allow our partners to be able to communicate with prisoners via that technology. It is absolutely central in being able to modernise. It's absolutely central in being able to support the reform agenda across all the different aspects of that. So I think, in a sense, my view and my message is that the digitisation of prisons is really the glue that binds the whole lot together. We're the one thing that seems to go through the whole system and enables everybody to join up and communicate and seamlessly support a prisoner through their sentence and also be able to easily join up the different services. Obviously we're all working hard to try and work with each other to realise that, but the basic infrastructure is currently missing from our institutions. So until we get that in place, we're not going to be able to truly have that joined up criminal justice working. And it is going to take us a bit of time to go there, but as Brian has said, we're already on with the process of implementing those networks, that infrastructure, and hopefully by the end of the next financial year we should have 21 prisons up and running or as near about. And our intention is then to develop and plan to take forward that infrastructure across the whole prison estate. And we're already working with prison reform to bake that into the new prisons that are being built as well, so that they open with that technology in place, just as Berwick in North Wales has opened with the network and infrastructure already in place. So I think it's a great opportunity to absolutely transform then not only order and control within establishments, but also to give people like Ian and his staff a new way of being able to take prisoners through the process of reform and rehabilitation. So it will allow officers eventually to be able to give digital support to prisoners in terms of taking them forward on that journey by being able to give them access in a controlled and secure way to digital products. So an example of that might be our prison education. We all know that we have a huge ask in terms of trying to move prisoners' education forward. They typically come in with fairly low standards of education. So by using the technology, free access to that technology, and also being able to modernise education for teachers and instructors within prisons, we're able to actually leverage a far greater impact of education across our sites than we could simply do by having one-to-one interactions. And we can also offer up the opportunity to prisoners to do self-learning in a way we currently are really struggling to get them to engage with, because we're very dependent on them using paper means. So for me, and in summary, I think that if we are truly to be able to get prisons and probations to join up in that rehabilitative journey, then we've got to go through this process of digitisation. I think in any other part of government, you will find digital footprints in everything that we do. So I don't think prisons should be treated any differently in that respect, or prisoners. If we're expecting prisoners to become law-abiding citizens upon release, then actually what we've got to do is we've got to treat them in a way, in a safe and secure way, to a degree, in the same way we would expect them to behave within custody as they would out in the community. And that also means giving them access to digital means. So if we're asking somebody to get a job when they get released or engage with education, for example, then we need to be able to give them a digital means of being able to apply for those jobs before they get released, because we all know if they get released and they don't have those opportunities in custody, then the likelihood of them being able to stay away from a life of crime is greatly reduced. We've already heard about housing. In terms of housing, likewise, if you want to apply for housing upon relief, most of this is done digitally these days. It's very, very challenging for an offender then to go through the already challenging process of accessing housing if we don't start giving them access digitally before they get released to the application process for housing. So it's absolutely vital that we accept and embrace this sort of digital journey that we're going through. I think in terms of how we take forward the whole criminal justice system, we just need to join up the last bit of the jigsaw digitally, which is making sure those networks are taken forward within prisons. Thank you.
Good morning. Firstly, many thanks to Reform for arranging this really vital event, because rehabilitation has to be at the heart of what we do. And I think we should open by recognising that new prisons just announced and to be built during this Parliament will still be playing a role in our system into the 22nd century. And so it's vital that correct thought is now given not only to the architecture, the physical architecture, but also the digital architecture and the infrastructure, as has been talked about this morning. We all know that the real art of running successful prisons is based on relationships between prisoners and staff. And I found the question after the last session about the relationship between prisoners and staff and the impact of technology on that to be vital. Because like the other private sector operators, Serco, Sodexo, we've had these kiosks in place for many years. And I'm a huge fan of the kiosks whereby prisoners can actually order their lives and their organisation. However, without being a Luddite in any shape or form, the one question I pose and find myself posing to myself increasingly is what are they doing to the quality of relationships and the need and the dynamics between prisoners and staff. And I'm hoping that the new offender management model, as referred to by Ian, will actually begin to readdress some of those issues. We're in an era whereby people, us and prisoners and staff, communicate increasingly with fingers and thumbs as opposed to some verbal skills. And I think we have to really develop the technology to understand that and to provide the opportunities for that form of conversation. Inevitably at the moment, anyone working in prisons tends to concentrate on some of the negatives. The media encourage us to do that, and both Gary and Ian have referred to that. And I think sometimes we just need to take a moment to reflect on where we've come from to this moment in time. I've been working in the prison system since the 1980s, and I look back and I think about the incredible amount of sexism, of racism, of homophobia. You couldn't talk about staff corruption in those days. It was the era of slopping out of 3 people to a cell. And really, purposeful activity and what works agenda wasn't really talked about. And there was very little, if any, managerialism. I'm delighted that the decency agenda, as begun really under Martin Nery's leadership in the 1990s, began to change that, and we're carrying on that journey. And we are at one stage in that journey at the moment. So I think, whilst recognising the current challenges that we all know exist, we should also celebrate the progress that has been made. But we also know that progress can be incredibly fragile. I know from my experience at Birmingham last December and other prisons experienced during the latter part of last year that this is a fragile concept. Safe prisons are built on positive, not coercive, control and relationships. And it's a truism that we can only care if we control the environment, as Ian said. And I reflect back to just a few weeks before the Birmingham disturbance, and we'd hosted the first UK prisoner versus prisoner debating competition in partnership with the Institute of Ideas. Fantastic day, huge representation, and people from outside began to see prisoners in a different light because of the debating quality. More importantly, prisoners began to see themselves in a different light. And I watched the growth of self-esteem and so forth in the people taking part in that competition. And I think that's vital for their rehabilitation. And so I argue very strongly, and without any apology, that huge progress had been made at Birmingham since the 1st of October 2011, and as reported by Professor Alison Liebling. And that was accomplished in partnership with the POA, with other organisations, and that's another message for the future, that we have to work in partnership increasingly. I'm absolutely determined that Birmingham must not and will not be defined by the events of 16th December last year. Actually, it's defined by the progress since the 1st of October 2011. And we won't simply get back to where we were. We're heading a long way ahead of that. But the long-term goal for all prisons has to be to put rehabilitation at the heart of prison life. And we all know that there are 3 elements that are vital, and that's accommodation, that's work/training, and that's about relationships. If we can actually reinforce that, develop those issues, we begin to rehabilitate far more effectively. And so I look at the work that we're doing in South Wales at HMP Park, in partnership again with Bernardo's and other organisations, based on initial funding from the Big Lottery Fund, but we are now taking that funding on ourselves because we see the value in this. And we realise increasingly that the most successful rehabilitation comes from taking a whole family-centred approach. We have one element. We've got the parent in prison. There are the families outside. There are children in school. And so real successful rehabilitation relies on a range of factors, both inside the walls and outside the walls, and how we facilitate that. And it's no coincidence that the programme that we work at HMP Park is called Invisible Wars Wales. It could be called Invisible Wars England, UK, etc. And the programme allows the prisoner's family to look through the prison's walls, to see the prisoner taking positive steps to really reintegrate himself with the family. And we're talking about some of the most difficult families in the community that we deliberately work with. And it also encourages, allows the prisoner to have a lens to look at the impact of his behaviour on his family and his children. And so we work with social services, we work with charities, we work with schools across the sector to actually challenge the prisoner, challenge the family, to energise the prisoner's bonds with the family and community. And inspectors have called this approach radical, innovative, and so forth. As part of the Big Lottery Fund, and because we would want to do it anyway on a moral basis, we actually share the information that we have. Public, private, international. We've had a wealth of people and organisations coming into Park, and we encourage that to look at what we do and what we've done. And of all the work that I'm accountable for, responsible for, and which I'm very proud of, the thing I'm most proud of is the impact that we're having on the family and on the prisoner. And I can talk about those impacts, but far more important is how they measured. And there will be research being published in the summer, which will really reinforce the message that I could give. And so I wanted to share some of the pre-publication indicators of the impact of this work on rehabilitation. If I look at the prisoner clients, and if I look at the NFA rates before Invisible Wars Wales, which were running at about 18% for this cohort, after involvement in the programme, that's dropped to 1.5%. If I look at the number of prisoners in the cohort who were unemployed, before Invisible Wars, it was 81%. After, it's declined to 32%. But for me, the most important factors and figures are about the impact on children, because we all know that we have to address the issue of intergenerational crime. And if I look at the school attendance rates for the children of this cohort, before, 85%. Not bad, I thought. After, it's gone up to 92% school attendance. If I look at the numbers of those children who are classified as being at risk, before, 20%. After, that's changed to 5% of the cohort being classed as being at risk. If I look at the number of children who are not requiring ongoing social services support, before 35%. After, 68% of those children do not require the ongoing support. We all know that the isolation of children is vitally important. Before, 9% of those children, or that children cohort, were classified as isolated. After, that's declined to 1%. And lastly, the number of those children who were victims of bullying, before 11%, after, incredibly, that had dropped to 0%. And I've talked to teachers in schools in South Wales, and we host, parent-teachers evenings in the establishment, and teachers say to me, I've never seen this parent ever before at a parent-teachers event. And we didn't realise the amount of ignorance in the teaching community and in the education community about the impact of imprisonment of a parent on the child in school. And again, if we look at rehabilitation, intergenerational offending, this is the type of work that we all should be doing. Ian talked about hope. I was delighted to hear that, because I keep finding myself banging on about the issue of hope. Because in my view, Invisible Wars Wales is successful because it introduces hope, which is a rare commodity in prisons, I would suggest, into the lives of the men, into the lives of their partners, but most importantly, into the lives of their children. We have to be, and I am, optimistic about the future of HMPSS and what we all do, because ultimately we've seen that hope can have a transformative effect on prisoners' lives and their family to address rehabilitation. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. It's really encouraging, I think, that both of the panels have had such a positive kind of tone to them, which is great, particularly in such a challenging area. There was actually quite a lot of commonality, or quite a lot of golden threads, to use the term that Katie used in the previous panel, between our panellists today. So this concept of seeing prisoners, and actually, as Jerry rightly highlighted, and actually several other people mentioned, not just the prisoner themselves, but actually the family as an asset in enabling better outcomes for everyone. I thought Ian's phrase around chances for change was fantastic, and again kind of was really echoed throughout the panel. I think Joanne's point around actually we've got to have long-term solutions. You know, we can't just have, and I think that's one of the frustrations, certainly something that Reform has picked up before around we might have a prisoner who's got a night's accommodation when they're released, but actually that's not going to do anything. You know, they need sustainable, secure accommodation the same way that they need work and maintaining those family relationships. And I also thought a great point about how can we use the Ministry of Justice's own assets to actually invest. I think that's a great kind of throwback to the department. Gary, I loved your point around prison digitisation should be, I think you said, the glue that binds the different reforms. And I think, you know, that message that's coming through very much, indeed, both in this panel and the previous panel, is that digitisation, technology, it's about enabling things. It's about enabling the change we want to see. It's not the end in of itself. And I think that was great, and again, very much echoed. And also the fact that it particularly, I guess, for this panel, that it enables some of those protective factors. So it enables the secure accommodation, it enables finding a job, it enables the relationships with family and friends, and I think that's a very powerful message for us. And then finally, Jerry, I thought absolutely fantastic opening comment in saying that, you know, we are building a prison estate for the 22nd century. You know, it's just a wonderful point for us, actually, I think, to really think about, because how do you future-proof public services when technological changes is just so fast, which again, you know, we heard from the first panel, but actually linked to that, if we can create prisons that are digital, then we can make the most of that concept of prisoners being assets. So whether it is kind of empowering them, enabling them to take responsibility, which will then mean they are that resettlement on release will be easier. That's a great thing. And you know, the invisible wall statistics, which we'll all look forward to the evaluation coming out. I mean, sound incredibly impressive. So it just shows what you can achieve if you invest in focusing on what delivers better rehabilitation and better outcomes. And then I guess I would just throw in a couple of things which sort of maybe were touched on, perhaps weren't explored, and I would perhaps encourage some of our audience to question these sorts of things. But we focused understandably, because we are a very prison-heavy panel, but we focus very heavily on prisons, but actually the through-the-gate element has to be in large part about what probation then does. And if we want that seamless journey, then probation are so core to that. And so I wonder whether there's something bigger around the devolution agenda. I can't remember who it was who mentioned the PCCs, but obviously we heard from Katie before, but actually, you know, what is the role for PCCs in a joined-up criminal justice system that genuinely delivers rehabilitation? And also, a few people mentioned kind of what works, how do we measure success? Again, something very close to Reform's heart. We wrote a paper, in fact the two authors are in the room today, Liz over there and Ellie, and Jerry actually contributed to that report. But how do you measure performance? How do you measure, what does good look like, and how are you actually going to hold people to account for delivering that, particularly in a environment where there is greater autonomy, because actually you're having to hold a much broader set of people to account. So perhaps they were a couple of additional things which sort of we touched around the edges, but perhaps didn't entirely get into. So wonderful set of comments. Very positive, but also a lot of challenges in there. Can I open it up to questions from the audience? I've already got people popping up hands. So perhaps if we can take two. If I can ask you to be fairly brief but introduce yourself, that would be hugely helpful. If I take one at the back, I've got one in the middle, and then John just here.
Thank you. Yes, hello. I'm Paul Sullivan from Inside Time, the prison's newspaper. I think most people in the room would be fed up reading some of the stories in the tabloids. For instance, when Berwyn opened, there were headlines that the prisoners had laptops. 3 weeks ago, there was a photograph of a prisoner with some cereals, a box of cereal, and it was, you know, these are living in luxury. Would the panel actually think that there is any way that the politicians can ride the derision of the tabloids in reforming the prisons? And just very quickly, secondly, do you think there is maybe more that you can do to get a message out there of what you're doing, why you're doing it, and the benefits to people, not only in the lack of more crime, but in the money that's actually going to be saved?
Great 2 questions, thank you. The lady in the middle, just here. Just here in red. Oh, look. Thank you, Ruby.
Hello, I'm Neera Sharma from Barnardo's. And we run a number of services in prisons, including Park, to help with visits. We run through the gate services, and we support children and families who've got a parent in prison. And my question is around maintaining family relationships, and we know that when that's done, it reduces reoffending by 39%. And the figures that Jerry quoted are just absolutely astounding at what can be achieved. And I've got 2 questions. One is around the cultural change that's needed to make that happen. Because on my visits to Park, it's been clear that they've adopted a family intervention approach to family visits. It's not security-led. It's about maintaining those relationships. It's about families, a very family-orientated approach. And whether the other reform prisons are going, how they're going to learn from that. And my second question is around the Earned Incentives and Privileges scheme, which sees visits by children and families as a privilege and not as a right. In female prisons, all visits are deemed to be a right and not a privilege. And we've had discussions with the government about this, and they have said, well, we want the reform prisons to start looking at that so that other prisons can learn from it, so that visits are seen as a right. They're not seen as a privilege like a television or a telephone in the cell.
Great, thank you. John, if you could just pass it.
I'm John Samuels. I'm an endangered species because I was a judge for almost 32 years, full-time and part-time. 2 quick comments. The first is, most sentences are there because they wish to serve the community, and they are interested in those whom they have sentenced and the progress or lack of progress they have made. Does not the digitization revolution, which we are promised, provide an opportunity for those within custody, or indeed the probation service, to report back digitally to sentences? My second question or comment to the panel is far more simple. We have had repeated references to offenders. In my professional lifetime, we have seen a transformation of language. We no longer refer to people in a way which makes people feel uncomfortable, which makes people's self-esteem feel lower than, I won't even finish the sentence. Why can't we get away from this labelling of those who have committed offences as offenders, particularly when so many of them wish to be, if anything, no longer offenders?
Great, thank you. So, having taken 3 questions, I think actually we've got about 30 questions in there. So if I can ask you to be selective in your answers so that we can get another round of questions in. So the first one was, I mean, a very good one that comes up a lot, which is actually, you know, if we need to deliver the radical change that we think we need to deliver, but we have some elements of the media that perhaps present an unhelpful picture to the public, then how do politicians get past that? And actually, you know, I think probably the narrative has changed quite dramatically from the political perspective over the last 10 years, but views on that. The question then about the cultural change and how do you there was actually a couple of elements of that around the families and how do you make that. We had the question about making it a right, and very odd that females have a right and not a male. I'm surprised that's even allowed anymore. But you know, how do we make family, the family model kind of central to all prisons? A question around with the sentences around kind of this huge opportunity that digitisation does offer in actually enabling sentences to see the impact and progress of those that they have handed the sentences down to. And that question around, you know, do we need a different language around talking about offenders, inmates, prisoners, whatever we want to say. So perhaps, Ian, can I ask you to pick, say, a couple of those and which ones you want to focus on?
The great opportunity of being able to pick the ones I want to answer, not the ones I can't answer.
Exactly. Sorry, Gary.
But I'm going to kind of try to cover most of what people said. But so on the kind of the press point and the political leadership point, I mean, I think I would say that in the last, I can't remember the dates now, 5 years, I think we have had, maybe slightly less, I think we have had really consistently strong and supportive messages from our senior politicians that have meant that we've not had the kind of pendulum swinging between attitudes around what's going on in prisons, and it's been very supportive and really important to us, and that continues, I think, with the safety and prison reform programme language and the bill and everything, really important. On the point of trying to open up, and we are doing, anybody will tell you it's much better to engage locally rather than nationally. You get a much more thoughtful level of response from local media than you do necessarily from most or some of the national media. We've done all sorts of things, and we do get those sorts of risks. So, you know, we opened our prison up to our local newspaper, got them come in and doing lots of photographs. And of course, some of the comments below the line are the sort that you reflect on there. But actually, most of it has been really positive. And you just ignore that and just get on with it and open it up and show people. And we've had some great work locally with the BBC doing some of that. On the culture and families, we're blessed in the North East. There's an organisation called NEPAX that's existed for over 100 years supporting the prisoners and families in the North East. And they're a brilliant organisation. So, for example, when we're thinking now about how we take forward the drug recovery prison at Holme House, which is intended to try to prevent drugs coming into the prison, one of our first conversations is with NEPAX about how can we get the families of the men to understand why we want to do this, why that might mean some increased levels of airport-style security at the beginning of their visit, but in order that their men are living in a prison that is safer, where there are less drugs, where there's less pressure on them to bring in drugs. So working with families to support the measures that we're taking, acknowledging that there may be some impact in terms of more searching, but that's a good thing and we're doing it for the right reason. So that feels important. And then just a couple of points, I mean, really important points, I think, on the work with sentencers. So I've always wanted to be able to have those feedback loops back to sentencers. I've always said it's the equivalent of a surgeon not knowing whether the patient dies or not. I would have sentencers much more engaged in what happens after the point at which they give the sentence, apart from anything else, to inform their future sentencing of other offenders. And I'm going to use that. Oh, that's the only time I'm going to use that word, because I think that's the right way to do that. And on language, I think you'll find when I spoke, I didn't use the word prisoner or offender because we've been really, really careful to talk about the men in our prison. It is only men in our prisons, so I can say that. So we talk about the men in our prison precisely for the reasons that you make. We understand the impact of labelling. I'm really pleased that we've stopped being, as of this weekend, we stopped being the National Offender Management Service, and we come back to being Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service. It's really unhelpful, actually, to label people and put them back into the thing that we're trying to say they aren't. They are an asset to their communities. They're members of society just as we all are, and we need to be clear about that in the language we use.
Thank you. And Joanne, that point about offenders, I mean, you talked in your opening comments about the fact that we need to have a better approach to risk in terms of accommodating offenders when they come out. I mean, is that part of the problem, the fact that we have, you know, we've stated these are offenders, and by saying that you're sort of almost implying they're never going to be anything other than offenders. So how might that fit into the kind of resettlement accommodation perspective?
Yeah, I think In terms of assessing people's housing needs, as a housing professional, I would look at people's vulnerabilities, their risks, the way in which they're excluded, and the level of housing need that they have, and maybe address those factors in selecting the right type of housing in the right community environment. And it does require more sophisticated understanding of what that individual's needs are. So you're absolutely right. It's about risk, but it's also about opportunity and the asset, the strengths that those residents can bring when placed in communities and how they can best play their role. So I do think we need to be better at risk and opportunity assessment, absolutely. I think in terms of the issue about the media perception, in housing, it's absolutely one of the key things. There is an issue about the politics of the deserving and the undeserving poor that runs across our sector. We see people in receipt of benefit being challenged, people in receipt of council housing, and that's partly because it's such a scarce resource and everyone wants and needs housing. And I think the way in which we can perhaps tackle the politicians on this issue and help their lives is that we as a society can stand strongly against homelessness and stand strongly against rough sleeping. We do become desensitised to those issues, and when we become desensitised, it's harder to affect change. So I think as a society we need to stand as a movement against those sorts of issues in this country so that we can help politicians argue and meet the needs of everyone.
Great, thank you. And Jerry, I mean, the point about the family model, so tucked within that question, I think there was a sort of an element of how do you share best practice and how do you get other, it's great that a prison is doing that, of course it's great, but how do you get a more systematic change across the board?
I think it's incredibly difficult. Even with my own estate, I can find it difficult to get over what I clumsily call the not invented here syndrome. And I'm sure I was as bad when I was governing a jail, that if I didn't invent it, it wasn't very good. And even if I use data, the park visits model, we show that because we've moved away from a heavily security arranged model into the family unit model, we've got 97% reduction in physical indiscipline in the visits hall. Wow. 85% reduction in live visit terminations. Uptake of regular family visits, UK average is 48%, at Park it's 69%. And it is about getting these stats out and encouraging the removal of the not invented here syndrome. I don't underestimate the difficulties. Like I say, I struggle with it even within my own estate in challenging people. But we have to keep on, we have to have the courage. And if I can then move on to the media issue, I'm one of those people who would like much more freedom than I have to go out and talk to the media, because I'm very constrained, contractually very constrained about what I can and can't do. I think we should be trusted more. I actually think there are messages to families, to the taxpayer and so forth that are vitally important. I've seen too many, what I then learnt to be called empty chair interviews after a bad news article or a bad news inspection. Yeah. No one's out there fronting it up. I think our staff actually expect us to have the courage to get out and say, yeah, this was horrible, this went wrong. Staff were incredibly courageous. And I actually would welcome far more freedoms to decide. And I think increasingly in the new social media world, we have to be much more intelligent about this. I know through the Birmingham incident, we were not only operating the incident, we're having to contend with social media messages of a pretty dire nature that we were having to contend with. Somehow, we've got to come to a more intelligent approach to social media and how we handle it. We've got to be trusted in that, I think.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And certainly for people who also want to go and visit prisons from a policy-making perspective, it's also quite challenging at times to be able to do that. Just to throw that out there. For anyone from the Ministry of Justice who's listening. So Gary, on that point around the sentences, so obviously kind of digital prisons, what is the opportunity and is that being thought about at the moment in terms of enabling those who have sentenced the men and women in the prisons, to actually get that feedback?
Yeah, you've got to put the infrastructure in first, so that's the key point, and then you're into the art of the possible. So the short answer is yes, you can do that. I'd also say that for the men themselves, or men or women in custody, also to be thinking about them reporting to the sentencer, because that, by giving them access to technology, allows them to have some responsibility in that process as well, rather than it being done to them by a probation officer or somebody who works for the CRC. So you're in the art of the possible, but without the network in place and the prisoners having access to the technology through that network, that's going to be challenging.
And any comments on either the kind of cultural change, sort of sharing of best practice, either from your role now or previously, and that question around how do we get out a more positive message?
So in terms of cultural change, I guess we've got to try and just articulate to our staff and to our partners the reasons why we are where we are and where we want to go. In terms of the media, I think the Secretary of State has very much sort of stood up to some of the points that were made. I think we've got to appreciate that. And I think we just need to, if we are asked to articulate the reasons why we are doing things, and just make sure that the Secretary of State and ministers are briefed and aware of the steps we're taking, and so that if they then have to stand up and tackle those issues with the media, that they're in a comfortable place with the facts, figures, etc. At their arms. You've got to accept that some of the elements of the media will probably always come out with headlines like we're giving iPads to prisoners without trying to think through why we might be doing that. Jerry talked about access to social media. I'm sure there were lots of prisoners on social media with illegally hand mobile phones where that network starts to allow us to consider blocking their access to social media whilst we give them access to digital media, but that digital media is being policed by ourselves and channeled appropriately.
And can I ask just on the cultural point, finally, how are prison staff? I mean, it was a great point you made in your comments around, technology should take away some of the, more process-based admin. I think you used the word mundane kind of tasks that prison officers and other staff are doing, so they can actually focus on, I suppose, in some terrible management consultancy type lingo. Apologies to the management consultants in the room, but the kind of the value added in interventions. How is that going down? Are you getting a sense from within prisons that people are embracing that?
Well, absolutely, because you have to remember that's a massive point of tension between prisoners and prison officers, because the prison officers do not have enough time, particularly given reductions in prison officers over the years, to meet all those admin needs. Everything in a public sector, not private sector prisons, because they have some of this technology in place, everything that a prisoner wants to do, they have to do through that prison officer. And the application system, which was designed in 1842 when the first federal prison, which was HMP Pentonville, opened, and really we've just built everything on that process. So actually to allow prison officers to be able to do their job better, we have to do that, and to make prisoners more responsible for the day-to-day, then we have to pass those tasks to them. It's what every company has done to the rest of us anyway, by making us book our own travel insurance and everything like that. So I don't see why anybody in custody should be allowed.
I think it's taking control, don't we?
Yes, yeah.
Great, thank you. I'm conscious, actually, we have come to the end of the session, so unfortunately we're not going to be able to open out to another round of introductions. I don't know if any of you are able to stay and whether people can ask questions at lunch, but I guess it just leaves it to me to, I'm not going to sum up because I think, hugely rich conversation there, and I think it's very clear what the messages are. But if I can just say a huge thank you for giving up your time and for sharing, such a wealth and such a kind of great insight as to both what the challenges are, but more importantly, actually, the fact that there's really positive things going on and that there's such an opportunity here that we should seize and really make the most of. So thank you very much.